For decades, the story fit into one brutal sentence. Queen Elizabeth II refused to let Princess Margaret marry Peter Townsend, the divorced war hero she loved. A royal no. Simple, severe, easy to repeat. Then the 2004 files opened. Inside the declassified cabinet papers from 1955 was not a flat ban, but a proposed deal drafted around the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden. A legal route existed that could let Margaret marry Townsend. Then came the catch. Margaret would have to give up her place in the line of succession, and any children from the marriage would be cut out too. So the real question is not whether Elizabeth simply said yes or no. It is why the only available yes came with a red line through Margaret's royal future. That is the story. A choice that looked like freedom and worked like an ultimatum. The document forces two stories onto the same table. One is intimate. Margaret, the younger sister in love with Peter Townsend, a decorated RAF officer who had served inside the royal household. The other is constitutional. Elizabeth as sovereign, Anthony Eden managing Parliament, and behind them the Church of England, the Royal Marriages Act, and the public image of the Crown. Hold only one story and the evidence distorts. Make Elizabeth the only villain and the machinery disappears. Make Margaret merely rebellious and the sacrifice disappears. Treat the 1955 compromise as kindness and the pressure built into its terms vanishes too. So the question tightens. Did the Crown protect itself by creating a choice so costly that Margaret would have to refuse it herself? The first thread runs to Elizabeth's legal role. Before the public could argue about the romance, the law had already claimed the marriage. That legal claim began in 1772 with a law built around a royal fear that members of the king's family might marry in ways that damaged the dynasty. The Royal Marriages Act required descendants of George II, with limited exceptions, to get the sovereign's consent before they married. In ordinary life, consent belongs inside a family. Here, it became a constitutional switch. For Margaret, that switch was still in the Queen's hand. She was Elizabeth's younger sister, close to the throne, and at the time the relationship became a crisis, under 25. She could not simply marry Peter Townsend as a private woman and ask the country to accept it later. Her marriage needed formal royal consent because it could affect the future shape and legitimacy of the crown. After 25, the door opened slightly. Under the Act, a royal could give notice to the Privy Council, and if Parliament did not object within a set period, the marriage could go ahead. So the law did not make marriage impossible, it made it public, political, and vulnerable to resistance. Then came the Church. The monarch was supreme governor of the Church of England. In the 1950s, the Church's position on divorce and remarriage, especially while a former spouse was still living, carried enormous weight. Townsend was divorced. That fact turned Margaret's choice from a difficult romance into a test of what the monarchy claimed to represent. Before the cabinet compromise of 1955, the trap was already visible. Margaret's age, Elizabeth's consent, Parliament's possible objection, the Church's teaching, and the succession line all converged on one relationship. The law did not close every door, it made every open door pass through the crown. And Peter Townsend was not an outsider in the usual sense. He had served the royal household from the inside. Inside that household, Townsend's reputation made him harder to dismiss. He was not a reckless court outsider who could be dismissed with a whispered judgment. He was Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated Royal Air Force officer who had served during the Second World War, and after the war became an equerry to King George VI. That role put him close to the daily life of the royal family. An equerry was part aide, part organizer, part trusted presence around the monarch. Townsend understood the codes of the palace because he had lived inside them. Margaret was young, glamorous, and already one of the most watched women in Britain. Townsend was older, disciplined, respected, and familiar to the household. On paper, his biography read like service, loyalty, and duty. Then one line in his biography turned the relationship into a political problem. He was divorced. In ordinary human terms, a marriage had ended. In the royal and religious world of the early 1950s, it meant something larger. A divorced man hoping to marry the monarch's sister forced the palace to confront the gap between private happiness and the public image it was trying to protect. Post-war Britain still looked to the monarchy for continuity after years of upheaval. The young queen's reign was being presented as steady, Christian, and morally reassuring. Margaret's relationship with Townsend threatened to turn that stability into an argument about divorce, duty, and modern life. Once the press began circling, the palace could no longer treat it as a family matter behind gates. The question was not only whether Margaret loved Townsend, it was whether the crown could bless that love without weakening the rules it claimed to embody. Before the cabinet papers and the formal compromise, the first solution was simpler: create distance. The palace did not need a dramatic scene. It had quieter tools: space, paperwork, and time. In 1953, Peter Townsend was appointed air attaché at the British Embassy in Brussels. On paper, this was a diplomatic posting for a senior RAF officer. It did not dissolve the relationship. It did not change the Royal Marriages Act. It did not make Margaret free or Townsend newly unacceptable in law. But it moved him out of the royal household's daily orbit, out of London, and away from the photographs that were turning affection into a constitutional crisis. Distance could do what a direct order could not. A blunt refusal would have created a villain, perhaps a martyr. A posting to Brussels created ambiguity. It could be defended as ordinary service, described as practical, and left partly unsaid. Yet to many historians and biographers, it has looked like a managed separation. The name often attached to that machinery is Tommy Lascelles, the Queen's formidable private secretary, shaped by the older royal court and committed to protecting the institution from scandal. Accounts differ on exactly who pushed which decision, so this should not become a single-person plot. But the effect was clear. Townsend was no longer nearby, and Margaret was left inside the palace system, waiting. Waiting mattered because Margaret was still under 25. Once she reached that age, the legal route changed. She could, in theory, marry without the sovereign's direct consent if she gave notice and Parliament did not block it. The Brussels appointment bought the crown 2 years. 2 years for the press storm to be managed, 2 years for public emotion to cool, 2 years for ministers, courtiers, church leaders, and the Queen to avoid an immediate final confrontation. But delay is not neutral when one side controls the calendar. For Margaret, time narrowed the room around her. It kept Townsend physically distant while keeping the choice emotionally alive. By 1955, Margaret was approaching 25. The cooling-off period was ending. Behind government doors, distance was about to become a written compromise with a cost attached. Then the paper trail takes over. In 2004, files released by the UK National Archives showed what was being discussed inside government in 1955. Not a stamped refusal, not a private sisterly command. A legal workaround. The Prime Minister was Anthony Eden, himself a divorced man who had remarried. In the cabinet papers, Eden was prepared to pursue legislation that would change the path Margaret had been trapped inside since 1772. The proposal was to amend the Royal Marriages Act so Margaret could marry Peter Townsend without forcing the Queen to give direct consent, which would put the sovereign, the church, and the government in open conflict. But the door opened onto a red line. Under the proposed arrangement, Margaret would have to renounce her place in the line of succession, not only for herself. Any children from the marriage would be excluded too. The romance could move forward, but it would be cut away from the future of the crown. That detail changes the shape of the story. The documents suggest Margaret may still have been able to remain Princess Margaret and may have kept her civil list allowance. So this was not necessarily total expulsion from royal life. It was more precise and in some ways more painful. She could keep the name, the rank, the public identity everyone recognized, but the hereditary line, the thing that made her more than a famous aristocrat, would be severed. The myth of the queen simply saying no starts to fall apart. The state had found a way to say yes, but it was a yes written in constitutional ink, with the cost placed directly beside the permission. Here the compromise changes shape. It stops looking like mercy and starts looking like the mechanism of the tragedy. On paper, Margaret was being offered a choice. She could marry Peter Townsend. She could avoid forcing her sister to issue a direct royal refusal. She could perhaps keep the title and the public outline of her life. But the price was not symbolic. It ran through the family tree. To accept the deal, Margaret would have to step outside the line of succession, and any children she had with Townsend would be born outside that dynastic future too. The red line would pass through her descendants. In the world Margaret had been raised inside, that mattered profoundly. She was not simply a young woman with a famous surname. She had been born close to the center of the monarchy, trained to understand rank, duty, precedence, ceremony, and the idea that a royal life is inherited before it is chosen. The compromise asked her to keep the outer form of that life while surrendering one of its deepest meanings. For Elizabeth, the structure had a different effect. As queen, she did not have to stand before the country and say, "I forbid my sister to marry this man." The government could point to law. The church could point to doctrine. The crown could point to continuity. Margaret would be left at the final junction, turning an institutional dilemma into a personal decision. That does not prove private cruelty. The documents do not let us climb inside Elizabeth's mind, or Margaret's, and assign motives with certainty. But they do show the effect. The arrangement protected the monarchy from a blunt public rupture by concentrating the cost on the person who wanted the marriage. If there was betrayal here, it was not necessarily the melodrama of one sister stabbing another in the back. It was colder, a family relationship absorbed into an institution until love had to negotiate with succession, church teaching, parliamentary risk, and the image of the crown. Margaret could choose Townsend, but only by accepting a permanent constitutional downgrade for herself and for any children who followed. Or she could choose the crown and lose the man. By late October 1955, that private calculation was about to become public record. When that calculation reached the public, the machinery disappeared. No cabinet problem, no legal bargain, no negotiation over succession. It appeared as Margaret's own voice. On October 31, 1955, Princess Margaret issued the statement that ended the romance. She announced that she had decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. The words were formal, controlled, and unmistakably royal. She said she had been mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth. That sentence carried more than one message. It placed the decision inside faith, duty, and public service, not inside a fight between sisters. It reassured a country still watching the monarchy as a moral institution, and it allowed the crown to move past the crisis without Parliament being forced into a public battle over whether the Queen's sister could marry a divorced man. For readers opening their newspapers the next morning, the story looked like a voluntary renunciation. Margaret had chosen duty. She had accepted the rules. The dangerous romance was over. But the later files change the shape of that moment. They do not erase Margaret's agency, and they do not prove that her statement was false. Her religious language mattered, her public role mattered, but behind those careful words was a route to marriage that would have cost her place in the succession, marked any future children outside that line, and publicly separated her personal life from the royal future she had been born into. So the statement became the final document in a chain, the Royal Marriages Act, The cabinet discussions, the proposed bill, the succession clause, and then one woman's announcement, carrying all of it in a few polished lines. In 1955, the public could see the sacrifice. Only decades later could they see more of the machinery behind it. This is why the 2004 files matter. They do not make the scandal cleaner, they make it harder. They show a monarchy working through law, cabinet procedure, church authority, and public expectation until a private desire became a constitutional problem. They show a queen who was also Margaret's sister, and a sister whose consent carried the weight of the crown. When those roles collided in 1955, the sovereign role prevailed. The strongest evidence does not support the simple version, a jealous queen, a flat ban, a romance killed by one cold sentence behind palace doors. The more unsettling version is quieter. Margaret was offered a path to marry Peter Townsend, but the path ran through renunciation, her place in the succession, the future status of any children, and the royal identity that had shaped her life. The crown did not need to say no out loud. It could make yes carry the punishment. That is the pattern this story leaves behind. Royal love is rarely stopped only by a dramatic command. It is contained by rules, distance, duty, and consequences designed so carefully that the person at the center appears to choose the sacrifice alone. In Princess Margaret's case, that sacrifice was written into history as duty, until the documents showed us the price underneath. If you want more evidence-led stories from inside the machinery of royalty, stay with Palace Scandals.